This is a message from a viewer named Russell, and when I finished reading it, I sat at my desk for a long time before I could write anything back. It's not the kind of love scam story that ends with a man losing his retirement savings to a woman he never met. It's worse than that, in a way that's harder to explain. Because Russell did meet her. He flew to her country twice. He filed every form. He waited nearly 2 years. He did everything right, by every standard the immigration system asks of an honest man. And what happened to him at the end of all that waiting is something that doesn't fit neatly into any category. There's no single moment of theft. There's no one big lie you can point to. There's just a quiet, almost surgical betrayal that took place over 20 months and ended in 48 hours. And it left a 52-year-old electrician from Phoenix standing in his own kitchen at 10 o'clock at night, looking at a torn-up envelope in his trash can, trying to understand what had just happened to his life. His name is Russell Dwight Pemberton. He's a master electrician. He owns a small 2-man contracting business in the Phoenix metropolitan area. He's never been married. He has no children. He has an older sister named Diane who teaches school in suburban Chicago, parents in their late 70s retired in Florida, and a paid-off 3-bedroom adobe-style house in a quiet Phoenix suburb where he has lived for 19 years. He is, by every measurable standard, exactly the kind of man who is not supposed to fall for a scam, because he is the kind of man who can spot a faulty electrical panel from across a room and who has spent his entire adult life noticing small details that other people miss. What you're about to hear is the story of how a woman named Janessa Pearl Barangan walked into Russell's life through a dating site, performed the role of a serious, religious, restrained young Filipino schoolteacher for nearly 2 years, accepted a $4,200 engagement ring, allowed Russell to file a K-1 Fiancée visa petition on her behalf, prepared for and passed her consular interview at the United States Embassy in Manila, flew from Manila to Phoenix on a humid June morning, was met at Sky Harbor International Airport with a bouquet of yellow roses, slept in the freshly painted guest bedroom of Russell's house for 2 nights, and then, on the afternoon of her second full day in America, asked to be dropped off at a shopping plaza so she could clear her head and was never seen by Russell again. I'm not going to tell you yet what she had been doing on her phone in that guest bedroom while Russell brushed his teeth in the bathroom on the other side of the wall. I'm not going to tell you yet what was waiting for her behind that shopping plaza. I'm not going to tell you yet why. When Russell finally walked into his own house at 10 o'clock at night and saw the empty bed and the face-down photograph, the most disturbing thing was not what was missing. It was what was still there. What I will tell you is this. Russell did not lose hundreds of thousands of dollars to this woman. The financial damage was, by the standards of these stories, almost minor. What he lost was something he had carried with him for 52 years, a quiet, unspoken belief that he could look at another human being's face and know, with reasonable accuracy, whether they were telling him the truth. By the time the dust had settled 4 years later, Russell would understand that some forms of deception are not visible on any face, do not register on any instrument, and cannot be detected by any amount of careful inspection. And that lesson, for a man who had spent his entire working life testing whether circuits were live, was harder to absorb than any amount of money he had ever lost. This is his story. He asked me to share it because he believes there are other men like him out there. Quiet men, practical men, men who think scams happen to gullible people, and that they themselves would naturally see through anything fake. He's been carrying this story for 4 years. He's finally ready to tell it. From here, he tells it himself. My name is Russell Dwight Pemberton, and I want to start where she would have wanted me to start, which is at the moment when I made the decision that brought her into my life, because if I had not made that one specific decision on a specific Sunday evening in early autumn, sitting alone at my kitchen table after my sister had flown back to Chicago, none of what I'm about to describe would have happened. If you've been enjoying the stories I tell, please consider hitting the subscribe button. Your support is crucial for the growth of this channel and helps me dedicate time to making these videos despite my commitment to a full-time job. Thank you for being here. The Christmas before all of this started, my sister Diane flew out to Phoenix from suburban Chicago, where she had been a high school principal for almost 20 years. She came alone. She had a particular kind of relationship with me, a layer of older sister concern, and everything she said that I'd spent decades pretending not to notice. She had worried about me from the time I moved to Phoenix in my late 20s for warmer weather and steadier work. She worried about me when my one serious relationship, a 3-year stretch in my early 30s, ended quietly when my girlfriend at the time moved to Seattle for a job and gradually stopped returning my calls. She worried about me, in short, for 20 consecutive years, and I had become very good at deflecting that worry with self-deprecating jokes about my bachelor lifestyle. That Christmas, she did not laugh at my jokes. She sat at my kitchen table on the second evening of her visit and told me, in a voice I had not heard from her since our father had been hospitalized 8 years earlier, that I was going to die alone if I did not do something different with my life. She did not say it cruelly. She said it the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis they have been postponing for too long. She said she could not keep watching me eat dinner alone. She said she wanted me to try a dating site, not because she thought I would find a wife on the internet at the age of 52, but because she wanted me to do something, anything, to open the door. I told her I would think about it. She left 2 days later, and for 3 weeks I did not think about it at all. And then on a quiet Sunday evening in early February, I came home from a long day of helping my one employee finish a job in Mesa, made myself a sandwich, sat down at my kitchen table with my laptop, and typed the name of a Filipina-American dating site into the search bar. I have wondered many times since why I chose that specific category of dating site. The honest answer is that an article I had read in a trade magazine months earlier had mentioned that international dating sites had a higher proportion of women who were genuinely seeking long-term commitment rather than casual companionship. I made the account in about 15 minutes. I uploaded one photograph of myself in a dark blue work shirt standing in front of a service truck. I went to bed that night and did not check the site for 4 days. When I did check it, on the following Thursday evening, I had received 17 messages. 12 of them were obvious, even to a man who had not been on a date in nearly 9 years. They were too warm, too fast, too full of declarations from women I had never spoken to. 3 more were polite but generic. One was from a woman who clearly wanted to talk about money in her second sentence. And one, the 17th, was from a woman whose profile I read 3 times before I responded. Her name on the site was Janessa. The profile photograph was a single image of a young woman in a modest dark blouse standing in what looked like a school courtyard. She was not smiling for the camera. Her description was brief. She said she was a 26-year-old elementary school teacher in Davao City, that she had grown up in a religious Protestant household, that she had recently come out of a long relationship that had ended badly, and that she was not looking for romance, only for a serious connection with a serious man. The whole profile was 3 sentences long. The message she had sent me was equally short. She said she had read my profile, that my work sounded interesting, and that she was sorry if I was not the type of man who was open to talking with someone from far away. She did not ask me a single question. I sat with her message open on my screen for almost an hour before I responded. Everything I had read about online dating had warned me to watch for love bombing, for premature declarations of affection, for messages that seemed designed to overwhelm a target with attention. This message was the opposite of all of those things. It was almost cold. And that was the moment, although I did not know it at the time, when she had already won, because I had spent my entire adult life equating restraint with honesty. A woman who wrote me a 3-sentence message that contained no questions and no flattery was, in my private internal accounting, the least likely person on that website to be running a scam. I responded to her that night, and the conversation that began with that response would continue, almost without interruption, for the next 11 months. The way Janessa wrote to me, in those first months, was unlike any way I had ever been written to before. She did not send long paragraphs. She did not send heart emojis or exclamation points. Her messages arrived once a day, sometimes twice, and they were almost always between 2 and 5 sentences long. She told me about the school where she taught a small public elementary in a working-class neighborhood in Davao City, and she described, in careful, precise English, the children she was responsible for, She told me about a boy named Jerome who could not sit still and a girl named Beatrice whose mother had cancer. She told me about the heat in the classroom in the afternoons before the rains came. She told me that the church she attended on Sundays was a small Protestant congregation that met in what had originally been a converted retail space, and that the pastor, a man named Pastor Eduardo, had known her since she was 8 years old. She asked about my work. Not in a flattering way, not pretending to be fascinated, but in the curious, technical way a person asks when they are genuinely trying to understand. She wanted to know what a service panel was. She wanted to know how I knew, when I walked into a house, where the wiring problems were going to be. I told her, more than once, that she did not have to pretend to be interested in residential electrical work to get me to like her. She wrote back that she was not pretending. She said that her father had been a small repair shop owner in a province south of Davao, and that she had grown up watching him work on motorcycles and thinking that there was something honest about people who fixed things for a living. After 3 months of writing, we began to have video calls. The first one was on a Saturday morning her time, which was Friday evening my time. She called from what she said was the small apartment she rented near her school. The room behind her was modest, a wall painted pale yellow, a small wooden cross hanging above what I assumed was her bed, a fan oscillating in the corner. She wore a simple cotton blouse, no makeup that I could detect, her hair pulled back. She did not perform for the camera. She sat slightly stiffly in front of it, and we talked for 40 minutes about her week and my week, and at the end of the call she said goodnight, and the call ended without any declaration of affection. In the months that followed, our calls grew longer and more frequent, but the tone did not change. She was not warmer with me as the relationship progressed. She was, if anything, slightly more reserved as we became closer. I asked her once, in our 7th month, why she did not say more affectionate things to me. She thought for a long moment before she answered. She said that the man she had been engaged to before me had told her he loved her every day, sometimes 3 times a day, and that he had been unfaithful to her with a woman who worked at his office for nearly a year before she discovered it. She said, after that experience, she had decided she would not say words that did not yet have actions behind them. She said that if I wanted a woman who would tell me she loved me before she had earned the right to say it, I should look elsewhere, and that she would understand. That was the closest thing to an emotional declaration she had ever made to me. I went to bed that night feeling, for the first time in almost a decade, that there was someone in the world who took relationships as seriously as I did. What I could not see, what I had no way of seeing, was that every word of what she had just told me had been written, edited, and approved by a man named Ramon, who was at that moment sitting in a small apartment in Daly City, California, watching her video calls with me on a separate phone propped against a coffee mug, and writing her notes between conversations on what to say next. Ramon was 29 years old. He had known Janessa for nearly 6 years. He held a United States green card that he had obtained 5 years earlier through a brief and quietly disastrous marriage to an older Filipino-American woman who had since divorced him. He worked the overnight shift as a hospital orderly at a medical center on the peninsula south of San Francisco, and on his nights off, he sat in his apartment with a yellow legal pad on his knee, drafting the next phase of an operation that he and Janessa had been planning for nearly 2 years before I had ever made my account on the dating site. In the 9th month of our correspondence, I flew to Davao City for the first time. I had told Janessa I was coming 3 weeks earlier, and she had responded with what I now understand was carefully calibrated reluctance. She said she would meet me at the airport, but that she would prefer that I stay in a hotel rather than at her apartment, because she did not want her neighbors to think things about her that were not yet true. I told her I had already booked a hotel. She wrote back that she was glad I had done so without being asked. The flight from Phoenix to Davao took almost 24 hours, with a long layover in Manila. I arrived at the small airport in Davao on a humid Tuesday afternoon in October, exhausted and disoriented, and I walked out of the customs hall expecting that I would not recognize her. I recognized her immediately. She was standing at the back of the crowd, slightly apart from the others, in a simple cotton dress and flat sandals, her hair pulled back the same way it had been pulled back in every video call. She raised one hand in a small, almost embarrassed wave when our eyes met. She did not run toward me. She did not throw her arms around me. She walked toward me at a measured pace, and when she reached me, she extended her hand for a handshake. I shook her hand, feeling a kind of bewildered tenderness that I have never felt before or since. And only after I had paid for a taxi and we had been driving for almost 10 minutes through the Davao traffic toward my hotel, did she allow herself to lean against my shoulder briefly and close her eyes. She did not speak for almost the whole ride. The hotel where I stayed was modest by international standards, but the nicest hotel I could find in Davao at the time. Janessa came to the hotel each morning around 10 o'clock, and we spent the days together walking through the city, eating in small restaurants she chose, visiting a market where she bought fruit, and explained to me what each one was. She paid for nothing herself. I insisted on paying for everything, and she allowed me to do so with a polite, slightly uncomfortable acceptance that suggested she was not used to being treated this way. In the evenings, she returned to her own apartment. She did not stay overnight in my hotel room. She did not even come up to my hotel room. We sat in the lobby cafe, sometimes for hours, talking, and then she would take a tricycle home around 9 in the evening, kissing me briefly on the cheek before she left. On the 4th day of my visit, she introduced me to a woman she said was her older cousin, a woman in her late 30s named Carmela, who joined us for dinner at a Filipino restaurant near my hotel. Carmela spoke careful, formal English, asked me reasonable questions about my work and my intentions, and at the end of the meal told me, with what appeared to be sincere emotion, that her cousin had been very hurt by her previous engagement, and that she hoped I would treat her gently. I would learn, 4 years later, that Carmela was not Janessa's cousin at all, but a paid acquaintance, a woman who lived 3 neighborhoods away, and who had been compensated approximately 1,500 Philippine pesos for her single appearance at that dinner. On the 7th day of my visit, Janessa took me to meet a man she said was her pastor, Pastor Eduardo, the same pastor she had mentioned to me in her messages. We met him at a coffee shop in a shopping mall near the church on a Saturday afternoon. He was a small gentleman in his early 60s, with thinning gray hair and a soft, deliberate way of speaking. He spoke to me for almost an hour about the importance of Christian marriage, about the responsibilities of a husband, and about the particular challenges that an international marriage would face. As he left, Janessa pressed an envelope into his hand, which I assumed at the time was a contribution to his church. I would learn, much later, that the envelope contained 5,000 Philippine pesos, that Pastor Eduardo was a real pastor at a real church, that he had genuinely known Janessa since she was a child, and that he had agreed for what was, in his world, a meaningful amount of money to spend 1 hour having coffee with her foreign fiancée and discussing Christian marriage. He had not been told that any of what he was participating in was fraudulent. He had performed his role honestly, believing he was performing a kindness. I flew home from Davao on the 14th day of my trip, with a quiet certainty in my chest that I had never felt before in my life. By the time my plane was descending toward Phoenix, I had already decided that I was going to propose to her on my next visit. I went to a jewelry store in Phoenix 2 weeks later and spent $4,200 on a diamond engagement ring. I kept the ring in the top drawer of my dresser for almost 3 months while I planned my second trip. My second trip to Davao was in late January, 3 months after the first. I flew over with the ring in my carry-on and a small velvet box wrapped in an undershirt at the bottom of the bag. I had told no one that I was going to propose, including Janessa. I had not even told my sister Diane that I was making a second trip. The reason I had not told Diane was that I knew, with the certainty of a man who had spent 20 years deflecting his older sister's concern, that she would tell me to slow down. She would tell me that 11 months of online conversation and a single in-person visit was not enough time to know whether to marry someone. She would be entirely correct in saying that. And I knew, in some quiet part of myself, that I did not want to hear her say it. I proposed to Janessa on the 4th evening of my second visit, on a small balcony of a hotel in a more upscale district of Davao than the one I had stayed in the first time. I had taken her to dinner at a restaurant that overlooked a small park, and after we had eaten, I asked her if she would walk back to the hotel with me for a moment because I had something to give her. She had become quiet during dinner. We walked the 4 blocks to the hotel in silence. We took the elevator to the small balcony off the 11th floor lobby lounge. I asked her to sit. I knelt in front of her and I opened the small velvet box, and I asked her if she would marry me. She did not respond for almost 10 seconds. She looked at the ring, she looked at my face, she looked back at the ring, and then her eyes filled with tears, quiet tears, the kind of tears that do not fall down a person's face but rather sit on the rim of the eye and reflect the light, and she said yes, in a voice so small that I had to ask her to repeat it. I slid the ring onto her finger. She held her hand up and looked at it for a long time, the way a person looks at a thing they are not sure is real. Then she put her hand on my face, and she said, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, that she promised she would not waste this. I held her on that balcony for almost 20 minutes before either of us spoke again. That entire scene, every detail of which I have remembered for 4 years, was a performance. Janessa had practiced that response with Ramon in the days before my arrival. They had discussed how she should react. They had agreed that overt enthusiasm would seem suspicious given her established personality, and that quiet, restrained tears were the correct emotional register for her character. She had practiced the line about not wasting this in front of a small mirror in her actual apartment, not the apartment she had shown me on video calls, but the apartment she actually shared with 2 female cousins in a different neighborhood, where Ramon visited her for several weeks every year using a tourist visa that he had been allowed to maintain because of his green card. I did not learn any of this until much later. On that balcony, on that January evening, I believed that I had just become engaged to the most sincere woman I had ever met. I returned to Phoenix 2 weeks later. I told Diane on the phone 3 days after I landed that I had become engaged to a woman in the Philippines and that I would be filing a fiancé visa petition with the United States Immigration Service. Diane did not say anything for almost 30 seconds. Then she asked me a single question. She asked me if I was certain. I told her I was. She told me that she would support me and that she hoped she was wrong about the things she was not going to say out loud. The K-1 fiancé visa process is not a quick one. It is, in fact, a long and bureaucratically demanding process that requires the petitioning American citizen to produce a substantial volume of documentation proving the legitimacy of the relationship, the financial capacity of the petitioner to support the foreign fiancé in the United States, and the absence of disqualifying factors on either side. I filed the petition with United States Citizenship and Immigration Services in early February, 2 weeks after returning from my second Davao trip. I prepared the petition with the same care I would have brought to a residential rewiring project, every form filled out in my own handwriting, every supporting document organized in a binder labeled by tab, every photograph from both Davao trips printed and dated and captioned. The binder was almost 3 inches thick when I sealed it and mailed it to the service center. The process took, from filing to consular interview approval, almost 6 months. The petition was approved in late April. It was forwarded to the National Visa Center in May. It was forwarded to the United States Embassy in Manila in late June. Janessa was scheduled for her consular interview in early August. During those 6 months, she and I continued to speak every day, sometimes twice a day. The conversations did not change in tone. She did not ask me for money during this period. She did not request gifts. The only money I sent her during the entire 11 months of our correspondence and the subsequent 11 months of the visa process was approximately $3,600 total, and most of that came in the form of small remittances after she mentioned, in passing, that her aunt was ill, or that her younger brother needed school supplies, or that her church was raising money for a roof repair. The amounts were small, $200, $350. Once, $400. She never asked me directly. She mentioned the situation, and I offered, and she accepted with what I interpreted as genuine reluctance. I would learn much later that this was deliberate. Janessa and Ramon had calculated, with what I now understand was disturbing precision, that the operation they were running did not depend on financial extraction during the courtship phase. The operation depended on getting Janessa physically to the United States. Every dollar she requested before her arrival was a dollar that increased the risk of detection. They had agreed, from the very beginning, that she would accept only what was necessary to maintain the appearance of an authentic relationship. The discipline of restraint in their planning was the entire architecture of the deception. A scammer who asks for very little is, in the eye of the man being scammed, no scammer at all. They had understood this principle, and they had executed it perfectly for nearly 2 years. The consular interview in Manila was scheduled for a Thursday morning in early August. Janessa traveled to Manila 2 days early, ostensibly to stay with a cousin who lived there. She stayed instead in a small hotel in Manila, where Ramon had flown to meet her. They spent the 2 days before her interview in that hotel room going over interview questions that Ramon had compiled from immigration forums and consular interview preparation websites. He drilled her on every possible question. How did you meet? When did you decide to marry? What does your fiancé do for a living? What is the address of his house? What is the color of his truck? What is the name of his sister? They went over all of it repeatedly for 2 days until she could answer any question without hesitation. She passed the interview on her first attempt. The visa was issued in mid-August. She booked her flight from Manila to Phoenix for a Sunday in mid-June, almost 2 months before the wedding date, so that she would have time to settle into the country and adjust before the ceremony. I told her that I would prepare the guest bedroom for her, and that we would maintain separate sleeping arrangements until the wedding, in keeping with what she had told me were her religious convictions. She thanked me for understanding. In the week before her arrival in Phoenix, I prepared my house with a degree of attention that, in retrospect, I find almost embarrassing. I painted the guest bedroom a soft pale green. I bought new bedding, a quilted cream coverlet, white sheets, 2 new pillows. I bought a small writing desk and a chair so that she would have a place to sit and write in the journal I knew she kept. I framed a photograph of the 2 of us from my second Davao trip, and I placed the framed photograph on the dresser. I bought a bottle of sparkling cider because she had told me she did not drink alcohol. I cleaned every room of the house twice. I had my employee Manny, who had worked for me for 11 years, drop by the morning of her arrival to make sure he met her. He told me, after she had gone to use the restroom, that she seemed like a serious young woman. I told him I thought so too. Janessa's flight landed at Sky Harbor International Airport at approximately 11 o'clock on a Sunday morning in mid-June. The summer heat in Phoenix at that time of year is a particular and brutal kind of heat. Dry, immobile, pressing on the body like a weight. I waited at the international arrivals area with a bouquet of yellow roses I had bought that morning at a florist near my house. When she walked out of the customs hall, pulling a single mid-sized suitcase behind her, wearing the same simple cotton dress she had worn to meet me at the Davao airport almost 2 years earlier, I felt a relief so profound that my hands shook slightly when I handed her the flowers. She thanked me. She did not embrace me. She allowed me to kiss her once on the cheek. She said the flight had been long and that she was very tired. We drove from the airport to my house. She looked out the window for most of the drive. When we arrived, I helped her bring her single suitcase inside. I showed her the guest bedroom. She stood in the doorway and looked at it for a moment, and then she said it was beautiful, in a voice that was so flat I could not tell whether she was overwhelmed by it or something else. I attributed the flatness to exhaustion. I told her I would let her rest for a few hours and that I would prepare a small welcome dinner for that evening. She nodded. She closed the door of the guest bedroom behind her. I made a simple dinner: grilled chicken, a salad, rice. I opened the sparkling cider. When she emerged from the guest bedroom around 6 o'clock that evening, she had changed into a different cotton dress, and her hair was down. She sat across from me at the dinner table. She ate a small amount of the chicken and a small amount of the salad. She did not finish either. She drank 1 glass of the sparkling cider. She asked me, at one point during the dinner, where my computer was, and whether the Wi-Fi password was written down anywhere in the house. I told her that the Wi-Fi password was written on a small card taped to the underside of the router in my office. I gave her the password. I thought nothing of the question. I assumed she wanted to message her family that she had arrived safely. After dinner, she said that she was still very tired and that she would like to go to bed early. She closed the door of the guest bedroom behind her at approximately 8 o'clock that evening. I cleaned up the dishes, watched a baseball game on television for an hour, and went to bed myself around 10. As I was brushing my teeth, I heard her voice through the wall between her bedroom and the bathroom, speaking softly, in Tagalog, a language I did not understand. I assumed she was speaking with her family. I felt a small, warm pleasure at the thought. I went to bed, thinking that the next morning would be the first morning of the rest of my life. The next morning, I made coffee and waited for her to come out of her bedroom. She emerged around 8 in a different dress, with her hair pulled back. She drank a small cup of coffee with me at the kitchen table. She told me she had slept poorly because of the time difference. She told me that, before anything else, she would like to go to a bank that morning and open an account in her name. She had brought, she said, some United States dollars with her from the Philippines, and she did not feel safe keeping the cash in her bedroom. I told her that was a reasonable thing to do and that there was a credit union about 10 minutes from my house where I had been a member for many years. I offered to drive her. She accepted. She had not previously told me she was bringing cash. When we sat down at the credit union, the young woman behind the desk asked Janessa how much she wanted to deposit to open the account. Janessa took out from her purse a thick envelope of $100 bills. She counted them out on the desk. The total was $1,800. The young woman behind the desk processed the deposit. She did not ask Janessa to add me as a co-signer on the account. Janessa did not request that I be added. I did not insist. At the time, I interpreted Janessa's preference for an account in her name only as a sign of the kind of independence I had always appreciated in her. We left the credit union with the welcome packet. Janessa held the welcome packet in her lap on the drive home. When we arrived at my house, she went straight to her bedroom with it. I made lunch. We ate together quietly. After lunch, she told me that she felt overwhelmed, that the strangeness of being in America was hitting her now, that the exhaustion of travel was beginning to wear off, and that she would like to spend the afternoon walking around alone for a few hours to clear her head. She asked if there was a place nearby where she could walk around safely. I told her there was a large outdoor shopping plaza about 15 minutes away, and that I would be happy to drop her off and pick her up whenever she was ready to come home. She told me that would be wonderful. She thanked me for understanding. She went back into her bedroom and emerged about 20 minutes later with her purse and a small canvas tote bag. I noticed vaguely that the canvas tote bag appeared to be heavier than it had been when she had carried it in earlier. I did not think about this consciously. I drove her to the shopping plaza, dropped her off in front of a department store, told her to call me when she was ready, and drove home. I worked in my garage that afternoon on a small electrical job. Around 4:30 in the afternoon, I sent Janessa a text message asking her how she was doing. The message did not show the small notification that indicates the recipient has read the message. I did not think this was unusual. The signal at the shopping plaza was sometimes spotty. At 5:30, I sent another message. No response. At 6 o'clock, I called her phone. The phone rang 4 times and went to voicemail. By 6:30, I had called her 3 more times. All went to voicemail. By 7, I had begun to feel the first edge of something that was not yet panic, but was no longer ordinary concern. I drove to the shopping plaza. I drove slowly through the entire plaza, looking for her, scanning the outdoor walking paths, peering into the windows of the larger stores. I did not see her. I parked my truck in front of the department store where I had dropped her off. I walked through the store, feeling increasingly absurd, asking a few of the employees whether they had seen a young Asian woman in a blue cotton dress. They had not. I sat in my truck in the parking lot for almost 3 more hours, calling her phone every 10 minutes, leaving increasingly worried messages, watching the sun descend behind the strip mall to the west, and the plaza begin to empty as the stores closed. By 10 o'clock, the parking lot was mostly empty, and her phone was no longer ringing. It was going directly to voicemail. I drove home around 10:15. I parked in the driveway. I walked into the house calling her name, although a small, cold part of me already knew that the house would be silent. I went to the guest bedroom. The door was open. The bed was made. The framed photograph I had placed on the dresser was face down on the bedspread. The single suitcase was gone. The closet was empty. The drawer of the small writing desk I had bought her was open and empty. The bathroom across the hall, which she had been using, contained no toothbrush, no toiletry bag, no comb. The credit union welcome packet, which she had held in her lap on the drive home from the bank that morning, was in the kitchen trash, torn into approximately 20 pieces. I stood in the kitchen for almost a full minute before I noticed the engagement ring. It was sitting in the center of the kitchen counter in its open velvet box. Beside it was a single sheet of plain white paper. Written on the paper, in pencil, in handwriting, I did not at first recognize as hers because she had only written one word, and the word was so small, was the word sorry. There was no signature. There was no explanation. There was nothing else. I spent the next 5 hours doing things that, in retrospect, I find painful to describe. I called her phone 40 more times. I sent her 30 more text messages. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the torn-up credit union packet in the trash. I went back into the guest bedroom and looked at the face-down photograph. I did not yet allow myself to fully understand what had happened. I told myself that there had been a misunderstanding. I told myself that she had been overwhelmed and had perhaps gone to a hotel for the night to think and would call me in the morning. Around 3 in the morning, I lay down on my own bed, fully clothed, and stared at the ceiling. I did not sleep. At 6 in the morning, I got up and drove to the Phoenix Police Department to file a missing persons report. The officer who took the report was a woman in her early 40s named Officer Whitcomb. She had a patient, careful manner of asking questions that I have since recognized as the manner of a person who has heard variations of the same story many times. She asked me when I had last seen her. I told her. She asked me whether the woman was a United States citizen. I told her she had arrived in the country on a Fiancée visa 2 days earlier. She asked me whether her belongings had been removed from the house. I told her they had. She asked me whether the woman had taken any money or valuables that did not belong to her. I told her the engagement ring was on the kitchen counter. The officer was quiet for a moment. She wrote something on her notepad. Then she looked at me, with an expression that contained no judgment but also no comfort, and she suggested that, while she would file the missing persons report, I might also want to consider consulting an immigration attorney rather than waiting for the missing persons investigation to develop. I called the first attorney on the list, a woman named Kim Vu, that afternoon. Kim Vu was a Vietnamese-American immigration attorney in Phoenix who specialized in fraud cases. She agreed to see me the next morning. I sat in her office for 45 minutes telling her every detail of what had happened over the previous 2.5 years. She listened with the kind of attention that good attorneys have, which is the attention of a person who is simultaneously hearing what you are saying and matching it against a pattern they have seen many times before. When I had finished, she folded her hands on her desk and she said, in a careful, almost gentle voice, that what I had described was a particular form of immigration fraud that she had seen approximately 9 or 10 times in her career. She said that the bank account opening with cash I had not known about was the moment in my story where she had become certain. She said that the most common variant of this fraud involved a woman who already had a partner waiting in the United States, that the partner was almost always a man with existing legal status, that the operation was designed to use the K-1 visa as a transportation mechanism rather than as a path to marriage, and that the disappearance was usually planned to occur within the first 2 weeks of arrival. She was correct about all of it. Kim Vu helped me file a marriage fraud report with United States Citizenship and Immigration Services in the weeks that followed. The investigation was opened. It was assigned to a U.S. CIS officer in California, where the fraud appeared to have its operational base. The investigation moved with the slow, inexorable speed of all federal investigations, and over the following 4 years it would produce a notice to appear, a removal order in absentia, and a permanent legal jeopardy for Janessa that would prevent her from ever obtaining lawful status in the United States. None of that, however, would result in the actual physical removal of Janessa from the country, because Janessa had vanished by the night of her disappearance from my house into the substantial Filipino-American community of the San Francisco Bay Area, where she became one more undocumented worker in a city that contained tens of thousands of them. The man named Ramon had picked her up at the loading dock behind the department store at approximately 3:45 in the afternoon, about 40 minutes after I had dropped her off. He was driving a red Toyota Camry with California license plates. He had driven from Daly City the day before her arrival, had stayed overnight in a motel in Yuma, Arizona, and had arrived in Phoenix the morning of her disappearance. They had coordinated the meeting time through the soft Tagalog phone calls she had made from the guest bedroom, while I brushed my teeth in the bathroom on the other side of the wall. She had carried, in the heavier-than-usual canvas tote bag she had brought into the shopping plaza, a small selection of her belongings, the ones that mattered most to her. Her suitcase had been loaded into the Toyota in the parking lot behind the department store. They had merged onto Interstate 10 westbound at approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon. By the time I had begun calling her phone for the first time, they were already 2 hours into the drive to California. By the time I had walked into my own house at 10 o'clock that night and seen the empty bedroom, they were approaching the California border. Janessa lived with Ramon in the apartment in Daly City for the next 4 years. She did not file for adjustment of status. She did not appear at any USCIS appointments. She worked under the table at a small Filipino-owned restaurant in a strip mall on the southern edge of the city, paid cash for everything, did not open any bank accounts in the United States after the credit union account in Phoenix, which she had emptied and abandoned within a week. She and Ramon had a daughter together approximately 18 months after her arrival in America. Ramon's green card came under review by federal authorities in the 3rd year, when investigators connected the threads of the case. But he had been careful enough in his role that no direct evidence of immigration fraud could be established against him personally. The removal order against Janessa was issued in absentia at the end of the 2nd year. ICE was unable to locate her at any of the addresses on file. The order remained on paper, theoretical, unenforced. I learned most of these details over the course of the 4 years that followed. I paid Kim Vu, over the 4 years, approximately $18,500 in attorney fees. I paid USCIS approximately $1,760 in adjustment of status filing fees that I had submitted before I knew the relationship was a fraud, which were never refunded. The total financial loss of the case, when I eventually added it up, was approximately $49,500. By any rational financial calculation, I had emerged from the fraud with my retirement intact, my business intact, my house intact, and my fundamental financial security undisturbed. The damage was not financial. The damage was something I did not have a word for at first. In the months after Janessa's disappearance, I told my sister Diane what had happened. I told her on the phone, on a Sunday afternoon, almost 3 weeks after the night I had walked into my empty house. She did not say anything for almost a full minute. Then she asked me one question. She asked me whether I was eating. I told her I was. She told me she was flying out the next weekend. She did fly out that following Saturday, and she stayed with me for 4 days. She did not tell me that she had warned me. She did not tell me that she had been right to be concerned. What she did was sit at my kitchen table with me in the evenings and ask me, quietly, careful questions about how I was sleeping and whether I was working and whether I was eating proper meals. She made me a list on a yellow legal pad of 3 things I was to do every day. Eat breakfast, walk for 30 minutes, call her. I followed the list for almost 6 months. I told Manny, my employee, on the day after Janessa disappeared because I was unable to come to work that day and he needed to know why. Manny, who had worked for me for 11 years and was a man of few words, listened to the brief explanation I gave him in my driveway, nodded once, told me to take whatever time I needed, and went to do the job I had been scheduled to do that day by himself. He never spoke about it again. That was the kindest thing he could have done. The hardest part of the months that followed was not the grief, which I had expected, but a different and stranger thing that I had not expected. It was the loss of confidence in my own ability to perceive other people. I had spent my entire adult life believing that I could read a person's face and tell whether they were lying. I was a tradesman. I had sat across kitchen tables from hundreds of homeowners over 22 years, listening to them describe electrical problems, and I had developed, over those 22 years, a fairly reliable instinct for when someone was telling me the truth and when someone was withholding something. I had brought that same instinct to my interactions with Janessa. I had looked at her face on hundreds of video calls. I had sat across from her at restaurants in Davao. I had watched her cry when I proposed. At no point in any of that, at no point in nearly 2 years of interactions had I detected anything that registered on whatever internal instrument I had spent my life calibrating as a lie. That was the loss I could not get past. I had not lost my retirement. I had not lost my house. I had not lost my business. I had lost the belief, held quietly since adolescence, that I could tell whether another human being was telling me the truth. And once that belief was gone, I did not know how to rebuild it. I did not know whether I should rebuild it, because perhaps the belief itself had always been an illusion. Perhaps every man who believed he could see through deception was simply a man who had not yet met the person who could deceive him. It is now 4 years since the night I drove home from the shopping plaza and walked into my empty house. I am 56 years old. I still live in the same adobe house in the same Phoenix suburb. I still run the same small electrical business. Manny still works for me. My sister Diane still calls me every Sunday afternoon. The world has continued in all of its ordinary, grinding particulars. I have not been on another date since Janessa. I am not opposed to the idea, in principle. I tell my sister, when she asks, that I am open to it. But I have not yet been able to bring myself to do the thing to make another profile on another site, to type another careful description of myself, to look at another photograph of another woman, and try to determine whether she is real or whether she is a performance. What I have come to understand, over 4 years of sitting with this question, is that the kind of fraud that targeted me was not a fraud that exploited my weaknesses. It was a fraud that exploited my strengths. It exploited the very things about me that I had spent my life proudest of: my capacity for restraint, my distrust of theatrical emotion, my preference for quiet sincerity over loud passion, my belief that real things present themselves modestly, and that performance is always visible to a careful observer. Janessa understood, in a way that I had not understood about myself, that I was a man who would distrust diffusion and who would therefore trust restraint. And she had built her entire performance around delivering me the version of a woman I would find most credible. The cruelty of what she did to me was that the more carefully I tried to detect deception, the more deeply I fell into hers, because she had calibrated her deception to exactly the kind of detection I was practicing. I have stopped trying to find the lesson of this. There may not be one. I have stopped asking myself whether I should have known. The honest answer is that I could not have known, given who I was and what I trusted. What I will say to anyone who is listening to this, who has begun a similar relationship, who has found a woman online, in another country, who seems too good to be true in a quiet, restrained way that you cannot quite articulate, but that you find yourself unable to disbelieve, is that the quietness is not, by itself, evidence of authenticity. The restraint is not, by itself, evidence of sincerity. The absence of love bombing is not, by itself, evidence of love. The fact that she does not ask you for money is not, by itself, evidence that money is not the point. Because in some operations, the money is not the point, and the visa is. The fact that she introduces you to her family is not, by itself, evidence that her family is real. The fact that she takes you to her church and introduces you to her pastor is not, by itself, evidence that her religion is genuine. None of these things, individually or collectively, can substitute for the kind of slow, patient verification that an honest relationship can survive and that a fraudulent one cannot. I am working in my garage. On the Saturday afternoon I am recording this, on an old toaster that an elderly neighbor brought to me last week because she had heard I was good with small appliances. The toaster is from the 1970s, a chrome and Bakelite thing of the kind that does not exist anymore. The wiring inside is old and brittle. I am replacing the heating element and the cord. The work is quiet and patient and requires the kind of attention I have always brought to my craft. I have spent 4 years learning, slowly, that there are forms of truth that cannot be measured by any instrument I own, and that I will have to live the rest of my life with that gap in my abilities. I have learned that I can still trust myself on most things. I have learned that I cannot trust myself on everything. I have learned that the difference between those two categories is not always knowable in advance, and that the only protection I have against the things I cannot perceive is the slowness of my own life and the patience of the people who have known me for a long time. If you have been listening to this and you are at the beginning of something, if there is a woman in another country or another city or even just another life from yours who has begun to mean something to you in a way you cannot quite explain, I am not telling you to stop. I am telling you to be slow. I am telling you to ask her things she would not have rehearsed. I am telling you to introduce her to your sister and to listen carefully to what your sister tells you afterward. I am telling you that the people who love you in the ordinary way, in the daily way, are the people whose perceptions you should trust over your own, when your own are clouded by hope. I did not listen to my sister. I should have. I am telling you to listen to yours. This has been the story of how a 52-year-old electrician in Phoenix, Arizona, lost $49,500 and a much larger thing he could not put a price on, to a woman who flew across the world on a fiancé visa she had no intention of honoring in order to be with a man she had been planning her life with for nearly 6 years. If this story has meant something to you, please consider subscribing to the channel for more investigative documentaries on love scams and true crime. Each story I share takes a long time to research and write, and your subscription is what allows me to keep doing this work alongside my full-time job. Thank you for being here.